Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to first give you an overview of my research program. So my primary interest is in understanding how body fitness affects brain health and how the interplay between brain and body fitness changes across the lifespan. To study brain health, I use electroencephalography, or EEG. EEG is a really powerful neuroimaging tool that can be used to study the brain's response before, during, and after exercise. Today, I'd like to tell you about one aspect of my research program that uses EEG to study how the brain responds to physical exercise. Our cognitive ability declines with aging. However, some of us will age more gracefully than others. Consider these two 7-year-olds. One is thriving and one is not. But why? My research aims to understand the biological, psychological, and social factors that promote healthy aging so that we can keep more people healthier for longer. Physical exercise is one of the key ways in which we can support cognitive health across the lifespan. Older adults who are physically active have better cognitive ability, better memory, better attention than older adults who are not physically active. To give you a full appreciation of the benefits of physical exercise on brain health, I'm going to first describe to you some of the effects of exercise on cognitive health in older adults. And then we'll dig a bit deeper into the mechanism, looking at how exercise is changing the way the brain's processing information for better cognitive outcomes. To give you a full appreciation of the mechanism, I'm going to first talk to you about how the brain represents information in the form of neural network dynamics. And then we're going to look at how those dynamics change with age and with physical exercise. Let's start by looking at the effects of exercise on cognitive health in older adults. So it's the beginning of the new year, and if you're like me, you've set out with some New Year's resolutions. So raise your hand if exercise was one of your New Year's resolutions. Okay, a few of you. So keep your hand raised if you're still exercising. Okay, less. Okay, well, regardless of whether you're exercising now or not, let me ask you what a key motivator for you for wanting to exercise more. Why do you like to exercise?
To be healthier.
To be healthier. To be physically healthier, physically fit. How about you?
Look good.
To look good, yeah, to fit into those new pair of jeans, to physically look good. Yeah, and so a key motivator for many of us in sticking with our New Year's resolution is wanting to be physically fit. However, in sticking with your resolution, you're not just improving your physical fitness, you're improving your cognitive fitness too. And this is true regardless of your age. So for younger adults who are physically active, exercise can help improve your academic performance. For older adults who are physically active, exercise can help delay the onset of that age-related decline in cognitive ability, keeping you cognitively fit for longer. So what does this really mean? Let's explore this using this graph. So the graph is showing cognitive ability across the lifespan. And it's a bit difficult to see, but there's a range of cognitive ability that gradually declines across the lifespan. The upper and lower bounds of this range are determined by biology. However, we can affect where we place within that range by engaging in or refraining from certain lifestyle activities. So, in other words, you can help to place yourself closer to the upper edge of that range. Now, when you're younger, your placement on the range is of less consequence, and that's because you're well above this functional threshold. But as you get older, your placement really matters, and it can determine whether you're above or below the functional threshold. If you're above, you're healthy. If you're below, you're impaired. Consider the two 7-year-olds from earlier. Although it's obvious that the one at the top is in much better physical shape than the one at the bottom, he's also in much better cognitive shape too. He would place closer to the upper edge of this range for 7-year-olds, whereas this other man is placing below the functional threshold. What this means is that he's having some difficulty with his cognitive ability. He's noticing some impairments. It's harder for him to follow a conversation. It's getting more difficult for him to follow along a plot of a movie. And in particular, his executive function, or his so-called executive functional ability, he's noticing declines in this in particular. So what is executive function? Well, in our world of information overload, it's really important for us to select out the information that is important and to ignore the information that's not important. And so executive function helps us to filter out the information, keeping it all organized so we know what to focus on and what to ignore. Consider this simple example. I've invited you to my house for a party this weekend, and I've given you directions. My address is 111 Alexandra Crescent. But you get to this intersection, Avenue Alexandra and Rue Alexandra. Make sure you don't take Avenue Alexander, because if you take Avenue Alexander, you'll end up at the other end of the city. It'll take you more than an hour to get back. So make sure you take Rue Alexander. So keeping all of this information in mind, let's assume you don't have a pen, you don't have Google Map, you have to keep all this information in mind, and that's what executive function helps you do. Helps you to remember that you're not supposed to take Avenue, you're supposed to take the Rue. So this may seem like a silly example, and I've overcomplicated by making all the names the same. But in fact, the complexity of this situation is similar to that which older adults have to do every day if they're taking medication. So consider this scenario. No, this older adult has to take 3 drugs every day. The drugs look very similar. They're all the same color and fairly similar shape. Drug A, he has to be taken in the morning. Drug B has to be taken with a meal. And drug C has to be taken in the evening. So you have to keep all this information in mind. They look very similar. In addition, there's a different dosage you have to take of the medication. For drug A, you need to take 2 of it. Drug B, 1, and drug C, 1. So keeping all this information in mind, every single day you have to do this task. But now let's add another layer of complexity to this. Now your doctor says, let's change the dose. Your health has been changing, so we need to change the dose. So now your new dosage is 1 of drug A, 1 of drug B, and 2 of drug C. So in order to take your proper new dose, you need to forget this old information to remember the new. If you have difficulty forgetting this older information and ignoring the now irrelevant information, that can interfere with your ability to take the proper dose. And in this case, it can lead to a fatal error. So the ability to forget irrelevant information or information that's no longer important is a key aspect to everyday function in older adults. How do we test your ability to intentionally forget information in the lab? So we use this paradigm called the directed forgetting task. And it goes something like this. So I'll present you with a series of numbers. They flash on and off. 11, 22, 33, 44. So your task so far is to remember all of these numbers, okay? Then a cross comes up. And the cross initially is black, but then it turns to a color. And that color indicates which numbers you're supposed to remember. If the color is green, as it is in this case, you're to remember only the green numbers, and now you need to forget these 2 red numbers, okay? And so to test your ability to be able to forget and remember the appropriate information, we then probe you with 1 of 3 responses. So let's start with these 2 first. They're the more simpler ones. So 44, it was an old number. It was part of the previous list. Here it is. And it was one of the numbers you were supposed to remember because it's green. So the correct response for this is old. That's fairly easy. Now consider 55. This is a brand new number. It was not part of the previous list. And this is also easy to respond to. The correct response is new. The tricky condition, however, is the to be forgotten condition. number 22, it was part of the previous list, but it was the color that you were supposed to forget. And so, even though it's active in your mind, you had just seen it, and it's primed, you need to now actively suppress that memory representation so that you can perform the task appropriately and respond as if it's new, a brand new item. Okay? So you can see how tricky that is, and this type of processing requires a lot of executive control. Okay, just to make sure that everyone understands the task, we're going to try a sample trial. Okay? So I'm going to show you. You're going to do exactly what the participant did. I'm going to show you the numbers, and then the cross is going to change color, and you have to remember the numbers of the same color as the cross, okay? And forget the ones that are of the different color. And then I'm going to show you one of these types of numbers, and your job is to say whether it's an old number, if it was one you were supposed to remember, or if it's a new number, one you were supposed to either forget or a brand new number. Okay, everyone clear? Good? Okay, let's try it. Okay, ready? And the answer is new? Oh, everyone got it. Great. So this is a sharp bunch. Well, typically people have struggle with this one. But let's look at what happened here. So we looked at 65 or 67, 21, 83, 39. And then you were to remember only the red. And so 83 was the number, and the correct response is new. And everyone got it right. You must all exercise, actually. That's pretty cool. So let's look at how typical performance between young and old differ in this task. So here I'm plotting accuracy. This is typical accuracy for that critical to be forgotten trial. So that really hard one that you're all awesome at. So here I'm plotting young adults. Then I have older adults in two different groups. One are the high active older adults, that physically active, they engage in regular physical exercise, and the low active older adults who do not exercise very often, okay? So let's first look at the typical comparison that's made in the literature. So typically cognitive scientists, they don't even consider the effect of exercise when looking at age differences. They just group all the older people together and say, oh, they're just all the same, homogeneous. They don't consider exercise. But what we'll see is that that's important. So here we have younger adults that are performing much better than the low active older adults. And this is the typical pattern that we see. There's some decline in our cognitive ability with aging. However, older adults who are highly active, highly engaged in regular physical exercise, are significantly better than the low active older adults. And in fact, the age difference is no longer apparent. So what this is showing is that engaging in regular physical exercise is actually helping to support older adults' ability to perform this very simple directed forgetting task. So this mental task is being facilitated by your regular engagement in physical exercise. That's really cool. So we've talked about some of the effects of exercise on your cognitive ability. And in fact, I've shown you that directive forgetting task, but tasks like that tap into executive function are ones that are selectively affected by exercise compared to all other cognitive abilities. And so one question you may be asking is why? Why is that particular task or a task like that affected most by physical exercise? And to get an answer to this, we need to look to the brain and get a little bit deeper into the mechanism. So first, what I'd like to do is just give you a little idea about how we think the brain processes information. And this will help us to understand how that information changes with age and with physical exercise. So our cognitive ability, or way the brain processes information, is a dynamic process. Consider what comes to mind when you see this image. Just think about it for a second. You may recognize that it's Andre Agassi, the former tennis player, two-time US tennis champion. You may have read his recent book, his memoir, and remember crazy moments from his past with his really wild hair. If you know anything about his personal life, you may think that he's married to Steffi Graf, and you may know that they've been together for a long, long time. The point is, when you see this image, it's not just an image on its own, but it's this cue that is linked to all this rich information. And so when you're going about in the world and you're coming across faces and items, they're not items on their own, but they're linked to all of this rich information, all of this rich cognitive information. And to access that information, it involves a dynamic process that plays out in the brain. So how does this play out in the brain? Well, when you see a picture of Andre Agassi, it activates part of the brain network. Here I'm depicting the brain here, and we can think of it as a network. So where the brain regions, these dots represent the brain regions, and the edges or the connections between those dots are the connections between the brain regions. When you see the face, it activates part of the network, and that in turn elicits a response that can be measured by the EEG at the scalp. As that activation flows across the network, new information comes to mind, and the corresponding signal becomes more and more variable, more and more complex, until the whole memory or all the information associated with that initial face is recalled by your mind. So consider these two networks. So we looked at the complex network that's associated with Andre Agassi and linked to all this rich person-specific information. Consider now this much simpler one that has very few degrees of freedom for which activation can spread. So when these two networks become activated, they elicit a very different response. So the top one, with its many degrees of freedom for which activation can spread, will elicit a much more complicated or complex signal than this simpler one that has very few degrees of freedom for which activation can spread. So what in my work shown is that familiar faces like Andre Agassi that are associated with that rich person-specific information elicit a variable, a complex brain response. And that complex brain response is really a window onto the complexity of the underlying neural network. Okay? Whereas an unfamiliar face that is associated with very little information elicits a much simpler response because it doesn't unlock all that rich information. So the complexity of the brain signal is really a reflection of the amount of information processing capacity of the underlying brain network that's activated. Okay, so now let's bring this back to the central question about aging and exercise. So with age, as we've just talked about, our ability to process information, our information processing capacity is reduced. So you might think with aging that things get a little bit simpler. But what might be happening with exercise is exercise may help to keep things more complex and support the complexity of the neural network dynamics. Okay, so just described how the brain represents information in the form of neural network dynamics. Now let's see how those dynamics change with age and with physical exercise. So before I get into the results, I just want to really briefly tell you a little bit about the metric that we use to measure complexity in the brain. And I promise I'm not getting into technical details here, but just to give you an appreciation of the results. The way that we measure EEG, or the complexity of the brain response, is using EEG. And to quantify the complexity of that EEG, we use a measure called entropy, sample entropy. And so I only want you to know two things from this graph. Okay, so the first one is on the y-axis. We have sample entropy going from low complexity, so that very simple wave, to high complexity, very noisy. Okay? And so this information, it's an index of the information processing capacity. So higher sample entropy, more information. And along the x-axis, we have time scale. And what this represents, going from fine to coarse, is essentially at the fine time scales, we're talking about information processing within neighboring brain regions, or brain regions that are really close to each other. Whereas at the coarser time scales, what we're talking about is more distributed or long-range communication. Now, in the brain, you might think of the fine or the local information processing as neighboring brain regions, maybe perhaps in the visual cortex. Whereas more distributed brain regions could be sort of prefrontal to visual communication. So that's sort of the idea that we're thinking of with complexity, increasing information, and then this really talking about which regions of the brain are communicating, how the information is being communicated. So here's a typical plot of a young adult's brain complexity. And so what you're looking at, what you can kind of see is there's this bias, slight bias towards the distributed information processing. So there's a slight bias towards long-range communication. And so let's look at how this shape, the shape of this curve, changes with aging and with physical exercise. So during development, our cognitive abilities are improving. And so it may be reasonable to assume that the complexity of our brain response would follow suit. And indeed, this is what we find. So again, I'm just plotting that graph going from low complexity to high and from fine to coarse, or local to distributed. And these are the brain response from young adults or young children, 8 to 9, going to adulthood. And what you can see is there's this progressive increase in the complexity of the brain response. So as you get older and older into adulthood, you're getting a more and more complex brain response that's capable of processing more information. Okay, so this makes sense when we think about development. When you start out in infancy, things are very simple and highly redundant, and through processing of pruning and specialization, the brain networks become more and more complex and can support a higher level of cognitive function. So what happens at the other end of the lifespan? Is there a corresponding decrease in the complexity of the brain response? Well, to think about this a bit more, let's consider what's happening with the structure of the brain as you get older. And so this is just a cartoon depiction, but what I'm really trying to capture here is that as you get older, there's two main things that are happening to the structure of the brain. There's a loss of the regional brain volume, as I've depicted by sort of the shaded nodes or the dots. They're much shaded. But a key thing is the loss of myelin, or the connections between those dots. And as you can see, in some cases, like right here, there's almost a complete loss of connection. And so these types of changes that are happening in the older brain make the things that the brain used to do when it was young not as efficient. It's not as efficient at doing the same old thing. So, and a good analogy for this might be to consider an aging athlete. Like Andre Agassi, when he was young, he could rely almost exclusively on his power. However, as he got older, his power was no longer his competitive edge, so he had to change up his game. He had to add different shots, some drop shots, some slices, in order to stay competitive. And a similar phenomenon happens in the brain. So older brains that can adapt to these structural changes can maintain their cognitive function, whereas older adults who stay processing things in the same way that they did when they were young are suffering from impairment. Let's just look at these. These are fMRI data. And basically, I want you to focus on this circle here. And the key thing I want you to notice, these are young adults and old adults who are performing a simple cognitive task. The key difference is that the older adults are recruiting additional parts of the brain to do the same task as the younger adults. So they're doing exactly the same task, but the older adults are recruiting additional brain regions. The story gets even more interesting when we subdivide the older adults into low performers and high performers. So here I have the younger adults in the same task. Here are the older adults, and they're low performers on this particular task. And what I want you to notice is that their activation pattern of their brain, it looks pretty similar to the young adult. So they're activating sort of these two parts, and you can kind of see it's pretty much the same. Whereas the high-functioning older adult is recruiting a brand new part of the brain to do this same task. Okay, so older adult who's recruiting this new part of the brain is able to do the task better than the older adult who continues to try to do things the same old way. Okay, so being able to adapt is helping them to maintain their cognitive function. And a similar story emerges when we look at the complexity or the dynamics of the brain. So here's a picture. This is the response of an older adult who's a low performer on a working memory task. And as you can see, the curve looks pretty similar to the young adult. But when we consider the high-performing older adult, we see a much different story. It's shifting. So we've lost some of this distributed processing, this long-range communication. And what we've done instead is we've ramped up this local information processing, or the communication that's happening between neighboring brain regions. So there's this shift in the way that the brain is processing information, and this shift is supporting better cognitive function. Okay, so that's considering a group of older adults, and that's really interesting. But the same pattern actually emerges when we look at individual differences, and in this case we're looking at a simple cognitive task, a working memory task, but the same pattern emerges when we look at neuropsychological tests. So tests that are typically used in clinic to screen for dementia. So let's look at that for 1 second. So in the lab, what we've been using is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment to assess cognitive health in the healthy population. And this is used as a screening tool to identify people who may be suffering from cognitive impairment. And this is just a portion of the task. What you need to do for this part, the trails making task, is go 1A, 2B, 3C, 4D, 5E, and just follow along that. And this person who's with high cognitive health has performed this well. The next is to copy the cube, which he's done well as also. And then finally draw the clock, including the contour. He's got the numbers in the right spot. And he's supposed to draw it at 10 past 11, but he's missed up the numbers there. But overall, performing fairly high. He's got scores of 4 out of 5. We can contrast that with someone who didn't perform as well on this task. So we have the trails making task. He's not completing it. The cube he's got, but the clock he doesn't have. He doesn't get the circular contour, the numbers aren't on there, and the hands aren't in the right position. So this would be an example of someone who has lower cognitive health. And if we look at the complexity of the brain response for someone with high, moderate, and low cognitive health, as determined by the MoCA, we can see that there's a stepwise decrease in their brain complexity at the local end. So here's the high cognitive health, moderate cognitive health, and low cognitive health. And we're getting this stepwise decrease in this local information. So in other words, older adults who are doing more of this local information processing have higher cognitive health as determined by the MoCA. Okay, and the clinical utility of this could be really exciting, so I just wanted to show you that. But let's get into what's happening with exercise. What's happening to those dynamics of the brain when we're engaged in regular physical exercise. And to measure older adults' physical activity level, I've been using the activities questionnaire. And this is a great questionnaire because it not only looks at physical activity level, but it also looks at socio-cognitive activities like volunteering in the community, attending great lectures like this one. So you get more of a full picture of what the individual is doing on a daily basis. And so I had a group of older adults come into the lab, they filled out this questionnaire, and then we split them into high active versus low active older adults. So as you can see, the high active older adults are more frequently engaged in regular physical exercise. And so that's not too surprising because that's how I split them. But what is interesting to keep in mind is that this particular group, the ones that are high physically active are equally socio-cognitively engaged. So their engagement in the community is equivalent. And so that's really interesting and an important thing to keep in mind when we're looking a bit more at the effects of physical exercise on the brain, that it really seems to be specific to the physical activity and not necessarily the cognitive activity. Okay. So this is the mean response over 6 questions. So let's look at those 6 specific questions that went into this to really get a sense of how these two groups are differing in terms of their exercise behavior. So here are the 6 questions. They're about walking, outdoor activities, sport, resistance training, aerobics, and stretching. And for each one of these questions, the participant is asked, how often do you engage in this exercise? Never, give a 0, or daily, give an 8, okay? So we're with increasing frequency. And we have high active older adults and our low active older adults. So one thing that's interesting is that both of our groups are regularly engaged in walking. So they're walking a similar amount of time. And this is important to keep in mind because this is not how they're differing in the cognitive brain that I'll show you later, and this is not what is differing between the two groups in terms of their physical exercise. So that's a bit interesting. Neither are engaging much in outdoor activity or sport, but the high active older adults are doing much more resistance training, much more aerobics, much more stretching. And if we actually look at the numbers, the low active are doing these 3 things less than once a year, whereas the high active older adults are doing once a month, a few times a week. So they're engaging in these activities much more frequently. So keep this in mind when we're looking at the cognitive and the brain data, because it's these 3 different types of activities that are supporting their physical health. Okay. So here's the graph I showed you earlier with accuracy on that intentional forgetting. And what I didn't tell you earlier was that these were the same older adults. So we had them participate in this directed forgetting task. And now you know that the high active and low active are differing in terms of aerobics, resistance training, and stretching, and that's how they're differing. And they're performing at a youthful-like level in this intentional forgetting task. Now let's look at their brain response. So here's the brain dynamics for high active older adults and low active older adults. And what you can see is there's this shift. So the high active older adults have slightly higher local information processing than the lower active older adults. And this is the pattern we've been seeing before with the cognitive health. So the shift towards local information processing or communication within regional brains, within brain regions that are in close vicinity, is supporting cognitive health, as we saw earlier, but the shift is being facilitated by your engagement in regular physical exercise. So exercise is helping you to make this shift towards local information processing. So let's bring this all together. What does this all mean? Well, young adults have strong networks, and they rely almost exclusively or have a bias towards distributed information processing, long-range communication across the brain. Whereas older adults have some structural damage. There's a loss of brain regional volume, a loss of connection. Older adults who continue to try to do things the way they used to when they were young by relying on these long-range communications, the communication is breaking down because there's a loss of connection between those regions. And so this is disrupting their ability to perform those cognitive tasks like the directed forgetting task. In contrast, older adults who are able to shift the way they process information so that instead of relying on these long-range communication, they're focusing more on the local information processing that's going on between brain regions that are neighbors. This is actually helping to support cognitive health, and exercise is helping to facilitate this shift. This is a really exciting picture and one that we're just starting to explore. So I'm really excited to continue this work here at McMaster. So today I've told you about the effects of exercise on cognitive health in older adults. Oops. Sorry. I described how the brain represents information in the form of neural network dynamics, and I've shown you how those dynamics change with age and with physical exercise. Before I close my talk, I'd like to just give you a sense of my future directions for the research here. In joining the kinesiology department, I'm very excited about the Physical Activity Center of Excellence, what we call PACE. And this is an amazing facility. It's essentially a gym for older adults to come and work out. But what our plans are is to make this gym and the exercise program that the older adults engage in to be a full body and brain exercise program. So something that's not just good for their physical health, but good for their mental health too. And so we'll be doing continuous studies, trying to improve the program that we have. And it's a really exciting program that I'm doing with Kathleen Martin-Guinness, who's here. So that's one exciting project that I'm very excited about. Secondly, what I want to do is look at some targeted interventions. So at the Rotman Research Institute, it's a great facility, but I don't have all the resources to do the real targeted interventions that I want to do. And so the resistance training, aerobics, and stretching that differed between the high active and low active older adults, what I want to do is target these. So have older adults come to the PACE lab. We can have them engage in a resistance training program, and we can measure their cognitive and brain function before and after to see if resistance training is really the key to this shift in brain processing. Likewise, we could do the same, bring people into the PACE facility, have them engaged in aerobics training, measure their brain response before and after to see if that's what's changing it. So we can do targeted intervention and determine really how much training is needed to change the way the brain is processing information. Do you only need a week? Does this take 6 months? Can you get it within a year? So there's a lot of open questions to answer that are really exciting. And finally, something I'm really excited about is to partner up with some of the kinesiologists and look really at this interplay between brain and body fitness to really understand how the brain's processing are being affected by things like VO2 max, or our blood pressure, or our body composition, and really unpack this relationship between brain and body health. Thank you.